I have a short piece to read and then a very short piece to read, so those of you who keep track. How many of you, when you heard that Dinty Moore was reading tonight, thought, that is an odd name? Tell me the truth. I've lived with it all my life. That's the genesis of this first piece of, I'm a nonfiction writer, so this first piece of creative nonfiction that I want to read for you. It's a little bit about America's ethnic heritage and quite a bit about me. Mick on the Make, or son of George McManus. There's this popular comic strip, Bringing Up Father, created in 1913, but if you ask your grandparents, they'll remember it as Maggie and Jiggs. That's what everyone called it, because Maggie and Jiggs were fairly unforgettable. George McManus' daily comic followed the working class couple's ups and downs after winning the Irish sweepstakes. Jiggs, a stonemason by trade, didn't take well to the pampered world of chauffeurs and afternoon tea, longing instead for his old pals, familiar foods, and impromptu poker games at the corner saloon. Maggie wanted status, stability, and a reliably sober companion. Much of the humor derives from the tension between these competing desires. The final panel of the strip often depicts Maggie, rolling pen in hand, waiting silently behind the front door of their sparkling new mansion. Jiggs inevitably is sneaking home drunk, dress shoes in hand, reeking of corned beef and cabbage. McManus's comic was an instant and enduring hit because it worked on twin levels. The jokes were good, the characters well drawn, the situation instant prosperity, wrought with comic possibility. But underneath the jokes, the strip was sociologically brilliant, capturing precisely the passionate dreams and fears of the new immigrant working classes. For many Irish, the primary reason for coming to America was to move forward in life. But to move forward often meant moving beyond your own people, leaving behind what was familiar and comfortable. Songs, vaudeville acts, and other forms of popular humor poking fun at Mick on the Make were rampant at the time because they struck a deep chord. My great-grandfather, James Moore, didn't win any Irish sweepstakes, but after immigrating in the late 1800s, he managed to scratch his way into the middle class. He did this through real estate, marriage, or crime. I've heard all three explanations, but I've had little luck tracking down the truth. My father insisted that old James was murdered by gangsters and buried under a main highway of our hometown. But Dad told a lot of stories that later turned out to be far from actual. There's an expression for this sort of blarney: Irish facts. What is verifiable is that James Moore's only son, my grandfather Billy, lived in a grand house near the Erie Bayfront, owned a popular nightclub, managed blocks of prime real estate, and was somewhere between a civic leader and a scoundrel. Like Jiggs, he traveled in lace-curtained circles, but loved nothing more than to hoist a beer or two, or 6 or 8, with the old gang at Sullivan's Saloon. One of my father's favorite stories involved a high-ranking figure in the Catholic Church. The celibate man of God would drop by the house on Friday evenings, have a drink or two in the parlor, disappear briefly upstairs, and return down the steps in civilian clothing. He was round, solid like my grandfather, so all of the clothes fit him. Both men would then head to Cleveland for the evening, presumably to engage in pursuits the man found unavailable on his home turf in his priestly collar. My grandfather, he died 17 years before I was born, so I rely on my father's stories and a few yellow newspaper clippings. Profited from Prohibition. He owned a fast boat, lived in a city full of Irish cops. Canada was just a quick trip across Lake Erie. He once stymied federal agents by filling his speedboat with nuns from a local convent, ostensibly taking them on a comfortable afternoon cruise. The brides of Christ returned from Ontario with bottles of blessed nectar hidden under their full black habits. No treasury agent was going to frisk a good sister. Why would they go along with this, I once asked my father, thinking of the nuns in my own Catholic grade school. He just laughed. The nuns are Irish, he said. They liked a good drink. There's more, some of it not so amusing. My mother was born into a family of Chicago printers, fairly well established at the turn of the century, but circumstances unraveled when her father died. She was only 8, and barely 5 years later her mother died as well. Mom was raised by an Irish aunt from the less well-heeled side of the family tree. She married my father in part because she believed he was the ticket to regaining lost respectability. Her new suitor was from a prominent family, and when they met just after World War II, he claimed to be headed off to medical school. But the narrative arc was not kind to them either. Unlike Maggie and Jiggs, Bill and Kathy were headed down the ladder of class and affluence. My father was also orphaned young and raised by a kindly Irish aunt. Family assets were sold off one by one to finance elaborate vacations and private schools. In the end, no money remained to speak of, and by the time my father hit adulthood, my Army veteran father preferred hanging around the same saloons his father once frequented. He preferred this to the hard work of cracking open medical books. My parents' adult lives turned out to be an ironic reemergence of the old comic stereotype. Maggie, the wife, hounding Jiggs to stay home, be a family man, pay attention to the children, fix the faucet, stop all that drinking with ne'er-do-well friends in low-class dives. George McManus had them nailed. Anyone familiar with early comic strip history is perhaps well ahead of me, but for the rest of you, here's the kicker. Though the social themes of class tension and upward Irish-American mobility found in McManus's funny paper saga connect to my kinfolk in countless ways, what ties me most directly to this comic burlesque is that Jiggs was sneaking out night after night to visit a particular saloon, Dinty Moore's. My namesake was the third most popular character in Bringing Up Father, a wiry, mustachioed, cigar-smoking scoundrel in spats and a bowler hat. Dinty not only owned the tavern that Jiggs habitually retreated to when ducking out of Maggie's society soirees, but Dinty was Jiggs' best friend, his one remaining connection to the working-class world he so badly missed. Dinty Moore represented everything that Irish-American men of that time clung to like lifelines: buckets of beer, fatty corned beef, backroom card games, coarse language, and the absence of pesky family responsibilities that tended to dictate when a man had to be home. Not surprisingly, Maggie hated the rascal, often ending the daily comic with lines such as, "I don't want you sneaking off with that Dinty Moore fellow," or, "Ha, it's that Dinty again." So the question remains, why, in heaven's name, would a woman knowingly name her son after a comic strip character whose chief activity was luring respectable fellows out of their homes to drink beer and play cards? Especially given the fact that her husband stayed out night after night drinking beer and playing cards. There's an odd one for you. I should point out that just a week or so prior to my birth, Mom mentioned to the good priests at St. Patrick's her intention to give me the comic strip name. The priests made it exquisitely clear that they would never baptize me under their law. And as a result, my birth certificate and baptismal records list me as William. But my mother called me Dinty from the first second of my life, as has everyone close to me, and that's the name I live by and how I pay my taxes. The comic Dinty was a gentle stereotype, a wink and a nod toward working class male camaraderie. But the case can be made that it was also a bit of an ethnic slur. The Irish were lazy, drunk, unwashed, according to the prejudices of the time, and Dinty's comic character played into each of these. All in all, a great handle for a beaming boy. Mom's usual account is that her cousin Jimmy insisted any Irish lad with the last name Moore has to be known as Dinty. Jamesy boy, as he was called, was Mom's favorite male cousin. Probably enjoyed a good laugh when he opened the morning paper, but this still seems a pretty weak rationale. My best guess is that my name connects to the fact that my mother's Irishness was of such keen importance to her. She was only half Irish, in fact, and her father's side of the family, English and Eastern European, actual Bohemians, seemed largely to lose interest in Mom and her sister after the father died. It was the maternal Irish side, the O'Briens and Smiths, who became her comfort and support. So perhaps calling me Dinty was just my mother's symbolic way of staking claim to the part of her own family that did not disappoint or abandon her. Or maybe she had a better reason. My father, so the story goes, could not be found high or low on the August evening that my mother went into labor, despite repeated phone calls to Mentley's Tavern, Barilla's Bar, and the Cascade Club. He had a standing agreement with his favorite bartenders to say, "Oh, Bud just left," whether Dad actually had moved on or was sitting right there. This all sounds familiar to you, doesn't it? Maybe my mother was angry, and rightfully so, since she had, after 2 daughters, delivered what every red-blooded war veteran American male was desperately supposed to want, a healthy, bouncing, masculine child. So as expected, she named her pink-cheeked son William Jr., on the birth certificate at least, after his rascal of a father, and then, to make her point, she never ever used that name again.